my guess is that we can all agree that cockroaches are gross, okay? And if you remember a few weeks ago, we talked about that a little bit, how cockroaches can actually live for up to a few weeks. Yes, that's with an S, without their head. I had heard that before. I thought, I don't know. I want to know. I don't know if that's really true. Surely that's not true, right? It's true. I looked it up in Scientific American, and as they're talking about it, apparently they breathe through their bodies. So it's actually dehydration that kills them after they've lost their head. And depending on the environment, that can take a while. So pretty crazy stuff. And we're going to come back and we're going to talk about that a little bit, because our old nature, or our old self, really is kind of like a cockroach. It's dead. Like once the head is gone, like it's dead. We have died with Christ. Our old self is gone, right? It is dead. But it's like haunting us. It's not like gone in experience. So like it's kind of this weird thing where the spiritual reality is that our old self has died, and yet the actual like experience we have is that it rears its ugly head, kind of like the decapitated cockroach. But the decapitated cockroach, like, it is assured of death. It's going to die, and it's going to dehydrate. There's no way around that. But when? Like this, it's astonishing it can last as long as it does, and it's gross. Our old self is also gross, and we need to deal with it. And that's why in Colossians 3, if you look at verse 5, it says, "Put to death, therefore, what is earthly in you." Like, don't let it continue to exist. That needs to be put to death. Stamp it out. That's what Paul's saying. Then he goes to a list. And the list is a list of 5 words. The first 4 are sexual in nature, and then the last really deals with idolatry mostly. So the first 4 words then, sexual immorality. That the Greek word there is porneia, and basically it means any illicit sexual intercourse. In other words, like sex you're not supposed to have. So basically sex outside of marriage would be sexual immorality. Don't do that. Put that to death, because you're not of the old self anymore. Then impurity is a word that basically it follows on sexual immorality, and it's kind of like the consequence of that. But don't have that. Don't have that impurity in your life. You shouldn't do that. Passion then is a word that kind of the next 2 words are very intertwined. It's kind of interesting as I looked them up in some Greek lexicons there to kind of see the nuances, and some of the English words overlap between what describes those 2 words, and so as you look at that, passion, or like this lustful passion, well then evil desire was described as deep desire, lust. So you see lust in both of those words, craving. And so a couple of commentators that I really like is they look at those and try to describe like what nuances would you give to those words. Peter O'Brien calls passion the 3rd word in the list. He says it's shameful passion, which leads to sexual excesses. That's what passion there is. This shameful passion burning within somebody that leads them to sexual excesses in their life. Say no to that. Put it to death. Squish it out. Okay, that's what Paul's saying. Now, Richard Malick Jr. then describes evil desire as a habitual, uncontrolled passion or lust, as like, in other words, kind of number 3 in the list, the passion, in a habitual, uncontrolled kind of a way, becomes the evil desire. That's how Malick Jr. would describe that. Some overlap between those words, but obviously you can see where those 2, like words 3 and 4 in the list, fuel the kind of behavior that you'd see in the sexual immorality, the first word in the list. Paul's saying, put all of this stuff to death, from the actions to the desires, all of it gone. Get rid of it. Because the old self is dead, and the actions ought to be dead with it. So put it to death. Now, covetousness takes a little different angle in that. Even though covetousness can have sexual overtones, here it says that covetousness is idolatry. Of course, just about anything you put ahead of God really is idolatry. So you could use that for a lot of different things. And here, the idea is, obviously a very serious thing, because with covetousness, that is like the core of putting, earthly values above heavenly values. And if you rewind to verses 1, 2, 3, and 4, it's saying, put your focus on the things above, on heavenly stuff. That's where it's at. And covetousness is saying, no, I want here and now stuff. That's my priority. And Paul's like, no, you're dead to that stuff because you died with Christ. And if you remember back in chapter 2, verses 8, verse 20, there's plenty of evidence all over Colossians. Paul saying, you have died with Christ. Romans 6, extra credit that we had a few weeks ago, was also, again, the point to that, the Romans 6 thing was, you have died with Christ. And we've got to get that through our head. That is the spiritual reality. The problem is making our experience fit that spiritual reality. Now, obviously, that's going to ultimately happen when Christ comes back, he sets everything right, then our spiritual reality and the everyday experience of what we live out will be the same. But right now, we struggle with that. And Paul's saying, stamp out that old self-action, is what he's arguing. Now, to look down a little farther then, obviously, when you're looking at that list, you see all kinds of things in that list that wreak havoc on our lives. Like if we're living out the list of the old self and violating God's nature in that kind of a way, it's all kinds of problems for us. And, obviously a lot of those things are things that aren't bad in and of themselves. God created sex. That's not a bad thing in and of itself. You look at Proverbs 5, 1 Corinthians 7, all kinds of stuff in the Song of Solomon that would say that. It's just when we misuse things, then we're violating God's nature, his character, and how he designed things to be. That brings us to the next verse, and it's a real problem. It says, on account of these things, the wrath of God is coming. Now, when you think about the wrath of God, that's a problem. The wrath of God is this, you think of his nature, this recoiling within God of his nature against things that go against his nature. That's the wrath of God. Not a place we want to be. And so when you think about that, interesting definition for the wrath of God by Peter O'Brien. God's holy anger against sin and the judgment that results. So when you think of God's holy anger against sin, his holy anger that results then in judgment, that's God's wrath. We want no part of God's wrath. But we're objects of wrath. That's what we are by nature because we are sinful people. And it's only through Christ and him taking that wrath for us, him taking that judgment for us, that we can be free. And then we really become objects of God's mercy, objects of God's love and grace. And like we talked about a few weeks ago in Ephesians, he wants to show off his goodness and mercy and grace to us. That's awesome. We're like, yes, sign me up for that. I want a part of that. And that's God's generosity and his goodness to us. Amazing stuff. But God's wrath is just a part of his nature of the recoiling against the sin and the rebellion. And that is not a bad thing. You hear people sometimes talk about how God as a holy God, as a loving God. Well, how is a loving God, can he be a God of wrath and punishment and judgment? Well, pretty simple. We see all kinds of times when judgment is what's the right answer, when punishment is the right answer. We see that even in our own lives as growing up as kids or as parents, where we need to punish our kids. There needs to be consequences because that's the right thing. And, and in the long run, it helps our kids. And so, God's wrath isn't a bad thing, and it very much fits with his love. I wouldn't be a loving parent if I didn't wisely discipline my kids. And sometimes when you see something not good, you can have anger. Of course, as well, we're getting a couple verses ahead, because as people, our anger a lot of times leads us to sin, and that creates a problem. God's anger is never sin. It's perfect, pure, holy, and fits his character exactly. And his character defines what's right. So anyway, we better continue on in that and see that verse that deals with anger. And but verse 7 quick, in these you two once walked when you were living in them. Basically, Paul says, look, you were that way, but you can't be anymore. That has to change because your new self is different. And so then he goes on and he says, but now you must put them all away. And he goes into defining some more words of what that looks like. Anger, wrath, malice, slander, obscene talk from your mouth. Get rid of all that stuff. And we say, okay, well, that's a list of words there that obviously are not good. Anger and wrath, very much alike. Really, some scholars say that they find nuances of difference between those words. Others do not. We're not going to spend time arguing about that. But anger and wrath are things that as human beings generally are bad things. Ephesians 4:26 and 27, that's the only place I think in the New Testament where we actually can see a place where anger does not necessarily mean sin on a human level. But there is the warning, don't sin in your anger, and don't let the sun go down on your anger. And why? Well, because as human beings, if we let our anger fester, it's probably going to lead us to sin. We struggle with that stuff. So this list is no anger, no wrath. Get rid of malice. Malice is basically the desire to harm others. Pretty easy for that to creep into our lives. We don't want that. That's definitely a bad thing. And yet, malice, man, we're selfish people. Somebody does something to us, or we for some reason, somebody kind of grates against us, and we can have malice toward that person and want negative, bad things to happen to them. Paul's saying, don't do that. That's not how a Christian should be. We ought to be people of love, generosity, and compassion. Well, we sometimes struggle with those things, right? No malice. Slander. And of course, slander can easily flow out of malice, but basically slander is the idea of tearing down another person by lies or gossip. Pretty easy for us to get into gossip, and that's a damaging thing. We can't do that. But even within the church, a lot of times, oh, well, did you hear this? And pretty soon it turns into negative, more cutting, or even slightly negative cutting things, or just, or sometimes people gossip through, oh, well, you ought to pray for so-and-so. And a lot of times we talk about these things in ways that really are not good. They're negative, slander kinds of things, and we've got to be super careful about that stuff. Obscene talk, then. There'll be filthy language, talking about either subjects we shouldn't be talking about, or talking about, using words we shouldn't be using, some things that just aren't going to reflect well on the nature, on the reputation of Christ, and don't do that. So again, things we have to cut out in that. So then, when you look at where that leads us, it says, verse 8, but now you must put them all away. Anger, wrath, malice, slander, obscene talk from your mouth. All that, get rid of it. Next on the list, do not lie to one another. Interesting, the one another there definitely implies within the church, right? And, we ought to be looking for the foundations of trust, foundations of, solid relationships. And that's not going to happen when there's lies. It's easy for us to want to defend ourselves, easy for us to stretch the truth a bit. And Paul says, no, you can't do that. Be honest. There's got to be a foundation of trust for the church to be everything interconnected, woven together in the way that we ought to be. If you don't have that foundation of trust, it damages what the church should be. So he says, do not lie to one another, seeing that you have put off the old self. Again, it's talked about in the sense of you have done this, right? And that tension again. You've put off the old self. You've died to the old self. It's gone. Except for those actions that keep popping up that shouldn't be there. And that's, that's part of what we struggle with. And that's where we come back to, we got to deal with this. That's what Paul's calling us to do here. And he goes on then and says in verse 10, and have put on the new self. So there's a new life. And, in Paul's letter to the Corinthians, he talked about that. In Christ, you're a new creation. That's awesome. There's a newness to that. We were risen with Christ. We're raised. And so there is new life in Christ. We have life. Our old self's dead, died with Christ, but our new self is risen and resurrected with Christ. So there is new life. And we have life, but be very careful that we're living out the life that we have in Christ and not the old self. We want to make our experiential reality the same as our spiritual reality. And that's what this is all about. So we've put off the new self, which is being renewed in knowledge after the image of its creator. The idea of being renewed in knowledge, as we gain in knowledge, as our minds grow and learn more in Christ, then we're better able to understand and follow his will and be obedient to that. So super important there. So we're being renewed in knowledge. The more we know, the more we can actually do and follow through. It says that is after the image of its creator. It makes us think back to Genesis 1:27, right? We were created in the image of God. And yet, what did Adam and Eve do? And all of us ever since? Sinned. They put their selfishness first. And by sinning and rebelling against God's nature, against who he is, what he teaches, commands, his character, by rebelling against that, what do we get? We get the wrath of God because, he recoils against that sin. And against that rebellion against him. Not good. But we're being renewed into that image of the Creator because we rebelled against it. We rebelled against, him. Then we did damage to that reflection of him that was within us as being created as an image of, in the image of God. And sin tarnishes that and damages that. And this says, that's being renewed after the image, being renewed in knowledge after the image of its creator. Cool stuff. That's something it's talking about happening now. Of course, the fullness of that won't happen until Jesus comes back and sets everything right, but it's cool that it happens now as well as we grow in him. Verse 11, this is a neat verse. Basically, this verse is saying that there are no racial differences, no religious differences. There it's talking between like Jew and Gentile in that, in the sense of circumcised and uncircumcised. So like, no, you don't have to become a Jew to become a saved follower of Jesus. And that's where it's taught, the idea of there aren't religious differences in that. There's no, that doesn't have validity. It's all about Christ. So anyone who is in Christ, there's no religious difference. There's no racial difference. There's no socioeconomic difference. There's none of that stuff matters at all in Christ. Brothers and sisters in Christ are united in him completely and fully. And so this isn't just saying that those things shouldn't exist. It's saying they cannot exist because you are one in Christ. And so it just can't happen. And, the idea then of the barbarian would be like Greeks would look at, you had Greek or barbarian. That's it. Those are the two choices. If you're not a Greek, you're a barbarian. Then they would look at the Scythians as, like the lowest of the barbarians because they were kind of the worst mannered and, very lowly thought of. And what Paul's basically saying is, even for them, and even between slave and free, it does not matter. What matters is this: Christ is all and in all. That's the bottom line. If you're in Christ, you're united in him, you're combined, there's this connection because of him, and differences in race or differences in your backgrounds and all these things doesn't matter at all. That's what he's saying there. The old self, the old way of thinking, all that stuff's gone. Put it to death, stomp it out. And that's really what we come back to, because next week we'll be looking at what does it look like to put on the new self and live that out. But today, as we close this morning, the challenge for us is to figure out, do we have things of the old self that we need to stamp out? Like we started out talking, cockroaches are gross. And really our old self is like a decapitated cockroach running around without its head, that it's still like, I don't know, you can't really call that alive if it doesn't have its head. Like, it's as good as dead, but it's still moving around and doing stuff. And that's like our old nature. The old self rears its ugly head and flails out, and these actions come out that belong to the old self. And Paul's saying, get rid of that, put it to death. Well, with the cockroach, like, the only way to make it not keep moving around is to squish it, squish the life out of it. Then it will stop. And I think that's the intentionality Paul's talking about in verse 5. Put to death, therefore, what is earthly in you. Squish it out of existence, and then live out the new self. Because the new self is your spiritual reality. So you want the spiritual reality and your experience reality to mesh up and fit together. Now, obviously, we know that like the complete fulfillment of all of that won't happen until Jesus returns and he sets everything right, and we look forward to that day. That will be amazing and awesome. But at the same time, this is saying that, we can be renewed in knowledge after the image of the Creator. Yes. If our spiritual reality is the new self, then let's live that way, right? So let's stomp out the things of the old self, get rid of it, and let's make that a priority this week, to actually stop and evaluate. So I challenge you to do that. I challenge you to really think out what of the old self is still rearing its ugly head in your life, and how can you make your experience better fit the spiritual reality of the life that you have in Christ and the new self. That's something we should think about. Think of Paul gave a list right here. Obviously, it's not an all-encompassing list, but it's a very important list. So we could start with this list and say, do we have problems with these things? And then you don't have to stop there. You can think through other things as well. But let's make this, let's make our spiritual reality and the way that we're living out things match. In other words, Paul's basically saying, live like what you are. Do that. And that's what we should want. That's where we ought to be at. So let's leave you with a challenge, a little bit of extra credit. If you'll check out Galatians 5:16, Ephesians 5:18, and maybe some of the verses surrounding those verses. And that starts to talk some about what ought to be controlling us, and what that ought to look like, because otherwise we do tend to gratify the desires of the sinful nature. Galatians 5:16 would say, the only way to really fix that is, to live by the Spirit. And Ephesians 5:18 basically gives another example of, don't let this control you, but have this, the Spirit, control you. Right? So let's check out some of those verses in your free time and dive into that a little bit, and we'll cover some more of that stuff as we get into the new self next week. So again, verse 5, Put to death, therefore, what is earthly in you. Stomp on that cockroach running around, that grossness of the old self, and let's make that our reality so that we're free to live out the new self. And that would be a really cool, awesome thing. So kind of process those things, spend some time in prayer about it, enjoy this last song, and really think through some of what we've been studying as we do that. God deserves our very best. He deserves our focus. He calls us to think about what's above. And so let's really put our hearts and minds into that.